It's the year 2013. Moderat's second album drops and I'm completely obsessed. These tracks feel so alive, so three-dimensional, so breathtaking and emotional, and my productions sound flat and boring in comparison. So I started analyzing, breaking down every element, trying to figure out what's creating that depth. And then I see it. It's not which synths they used, it's how they were using them. Carefully adding live to static sounds in a way that I had not seen before. While I was just mapping envelopes to filter cutoffs, they were really pushing the boundaries and modulating parameters in their synths that I didn't even dare to touch before. And once I noticed this, I could not unhear it. In fact, I started hearing it everywhere, from Moderat to Trentemöller to John Hopkins, and then years later Biceps, Stefan Botzin, and now even artists like Anima are doing these types of things in their synth sound design. And honestly, from 2013 until now, every track that has ever given me goosebumps did something like this in their production. So this little sound design secret hasn't changed in over a decade. So in this video, I'll reveal the exact sound design system the pros use to breathe life into their productions and why the amateur workflow that everyone else is using actually keeps your tracks flat. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's a lead synth in the way most intermediate producers would design it. Sounds fine, right? There's nothing inherently wrong on a technical level. Now here's the same synth line, the only difference is I'm now applying the techniques that I'm about to show you in this tutorial. Hear the difference? That depth, that emotional quality that suddenly is part of the music? That's what I discovered in 2013 analyzing Moderat's music and then many albums and artists after that. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to break down why most producers create flat sounding synths, the 3 modulation layers the pros use all the time, and how you can use them in your own productions. By the end, you'll know exactly how to add that 3-dimensional quality, that emotional depth to your productions. But first, let's start with why your current approach isn't working. So here's the problem. Most producers only work on one dimension of their sound. So for example, they map an envelope to a filter cutoff, like it's the case here. Or maybe they even go a little bit more fancy and map an LFO to the wavetable position. And then they're done. They've added movement, so the sound should feel somewhat alive, right? Wrong. So here's what the pros do differently. Professional synth patches have 3 layers of movement all happening at the same time, but not synced with one another. The first layer is the timbre modulation, meaning the tone constantly shifts in interesting ways. The second layer is what I call dynamic storytelling, meaning the envelope of the sound actually helps the storytelling of the song, so it supports the arrangement in a really interesting and unique way. And the third layer is spatial modulation, meaning not only the synth patch itself evolves, also the rooms and sounds and delays and so on that this is being sent to, they are being modulated independently of the original sound. Most producers only touch layer 1 and they're not even doing it in a great way. That's why their productions sound flat. They're only working in this one dimension, not even touching the other one. Let me now show you what each layer does and how I'm personally using them in my productions. Now, layer 1 is the timbre modulation. And as you can see here in our original patch, the only thing we've done here is we've mapped an envelope to the filter setting. So this is every time the sound plays, the filter is opening up. So what do we have to do with this sound to make it more appealing, more interesting, more emotionally rich? One of the things that I really enjoy doing is, even if I have an envelope set to open up a filter, what I like to do is mapping an LFO to the same parameter and then gradually changing that sound as well with the LFO. The trick here is to have this not being re-triggered with every single bar, but instead have this constantly evolving sound. And I actually don't even like having this synced, so I'll probably just unsync this here and go to the hertz settings. So let it cycle in a very interesting but not so rigid way. So it doesn't sound like it's too planned. This is still relatively basic, but it still makes a difference if you apply only that thing. Now let's go one level deeper here. We could do something like this, add a second oscillator here. So we're going to use a slightly different shape. And then we're mapping the other LFO to this second oscillator position. So this means it's now sweeping through this oscillator. Once again, I will deactivate the re-trigger, and here I'll also use like a different rate. But to really make this fun, I'm mapping that same parameter to a very different setting that I really didn't touch for a long time. And that is the detune. So we can select the detune here of that oscillator and actually slightly, just a tiny bit, detune that sound. Now this little pitch flutter thing that we're doing right now almost sounds like an old wobbly tape sound, which is why it's so emotional, because of its imperfection that it brings to the entire sound. Now what professional producers will also do is they will intentionally detune the entire synth, or at least one of the oscillators, for example in some breakdown part before they enter the drop. So let's say we're right before an important drop of our song. What you can do is you can actually map the automation lane to the semitones here. And we'll start with, from like a basic thing, let's say we are completely at 0 here, just with a little bit of pitch flutter. We had that before, that's our normal sound. And then in the last 4 bars before this like massive drop that happens here, we have pitched this up 7 semitones, then we go over to 12 semitones, then 13 semitones, and then gradually shift up to 21 semitones, which intentionally rips and shreds this sound apart. Now there's one more way to modulate that is very often overlooked, and that is actually using things like velocity or pitch or expressive pads from something like the Ableton Push. Mapping these things to parameters can really level up your sound. So here you can access them in these MPE settings, and for example, we can take the velocity and map that velocity to the oscillator 1 warp. So the warping is basically this stretching and condensing of the wavetable. As you can see, the wavetable here is being warped whenever the velocity is like a little bit higher. And so here our sequencer is playing the notes. And as you can see with these accent settings here, some of the notes have a higher velocity. These are the more filled out ones. And this will trigger the warping to take place. So you can accent certain notes not only by the velocity itself, meaning the loudness of that note, but you can use that same parameter to then influence other things. And a lot of producers don't even know this. By the way, if you've already gotten something out of this and you want some deeper support than just watching tutorials, we do have a one-on-one coaching program that I can highly recommend. You can get all the details at pickyourself.com/coaching. The link is also in the description. Now that first layer, the timbre modulation, is what makes your sound more interesting, but the second layer is what helps you tell the story of your song. Now the second layer is what I call dynamic storytelling, and this refers to specifically modulating or automating the attack and the release of your envelope, of the main amp envelope of your synth. So this here is your main amp envelope. This is the output of your synthesizer. This is currently set to a relatively snappy sound. Now you can change the attack time to make it slide in a bit more, or change the release time to let the sound kind of like ring out, even to the point where it crosses with when the next note is playing. This works even better if you set your sound to poly, so that more notes can play at the same time. I like to use these parameters to enhance the storytelling in my arrangements. Here you can see how much automation you can actually do with just the ADSR envelope, and then also you sometimes have to counterbalance this with a little bit of volume automation, because otherwise stuff gets out of hand. If you're only using the first 2 layers of the system, meaning the timbre modulation and the dynamic shaping, you're already ahead of 99% of producers out there. But the third one is something that I've only seen very pro producers do, and is actually one of the coolest things you'll find. Now, speaking of being ahead, if you want to make progress really quickly, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework, my 3 simple steps to finish at least 1 great sounding song per month. That is my goal for you. I think it's totally doable. Just go to pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description, and it's the exact framework that we're using inside our coaching program as well. Now, the third layer is the one that most producers completely miss, and it is what I call spatial modulation. The secret to to complex and rich sounding sound design is not only in the synth patch itself, it's also in the effects that are being applied. Now, there are some synthesizers like Serum where you can already within the synthesizer map parameters and modulations to effects as well. What you can do if you use just Ableton stock effects, for example, you can use a send return channel, and then on that return channel, what you do is you actually map something like the LFO tool to your effects. So what I have here is an echo and a weird sounding granular reverb. Now you could also use just one of the Ableton stock reverbs, doesn't really matter. And what I will do is I will use that LFO, then map the LFO to specific parameters in your send return effects chain. So what I like to do specifically with something like the echo here is to modulate the feedback. The feedback is such a crazy cool parameter to modulate. Let me show you what you can do. So I'll map this to the feedback, bring the rate down a little bit, so we're like a little bit slower modulating into this. Now what you see is this is cycling completely to 0, and then up here you can actually change this and just make it a directional movement by clicking here on this little plus icon. So and then it's only applying this to the upper part of the curve, so we're feeding even more signal into this feedback circle. So you can already hear how this swelling thing could, for example, support that part that we were in before. Now, if that feedback gets too extreme, you can map the same LFO to, for example, the output of that and make it like a little bit quiet, or maybe the word dry, whatever you want to do. But I'll go for the output here, and I'll do it exactly in the opposite direction. So whenever the feedback gets more, the output actually shrinks down a little bit. So therefore, it doesn't get completely out of hand. Now, the problem a lot of producers run into when they try to apply this 3-layer system is that they just modulate things randomly and push it way too hard, and then they end up with something that sounds like complete chaos. So let me give you the rules and guardrails to make that system work in your own productions. So the first rule is to start simple. The biggest mistake is to work on all of these layers at the same time. So here's what I would do. So step 1 is to pick the most important synth in your production that's typically a lead sound or a bass. Step 2 is to start with this timbre modulation layer, and you modulate just 2-3 key parameters that actually influence the timbre of that specific sound. So maybe the filter together with the wavetable position and maybe a little bit of FM detuning. Get that working and sounding good. The next step is to add the dynamic storytelling component to your track. So you look at specific parts and see how can you use the attack or the sustain or the release, whatever works in your track, to enhance the storytelling of your track and make that synth sound really speak to the listener. And as soon as the first 2 layers are starting to come together nicely, this is when you start working on that 3rd layer that takes it from good to great. Now, I have 2 important rules for you if you work on this stuff. So the first thing is keep it subtle. So you don't want these modulations to be going all over the place and completely go crazy. So for example, this pitch flutter thing, like I'm using 0.4 here on this LFO. It's a really, really subtle thing, but it makes a huge difference in terms of how you emotionally perceive it. And then also the second thing is don't try to use everything in synced LFOs. You can always sync everything to tempo, theoretically, but very rarely do you actually need to. The sound very often sounds more interesting if you keep it a bit loose, and also you don't use the same LFO or the same envelope for everything. Use a little bit of that human touch to the sound. Don't forget that your beat is already on the grid, everything's programmed perfectly, so at least with the sound design, you want to have a little bit of character there and a little bit of imperfection. So back in 2013, when I discovered this, it completely changed the way I made music until this day. But sound design is only one aspect of the whole production journey, so if you want to also optimize your mixes, check out that video next.